John Carroll might very well be the smartest guy I know. I've been a fan of his razor-sharp insights in writing for decades, long before we became colleagues at Boston University. Full disclosure, many decades ago, and at another university, I was one of John's clients when he was a creative director at an ad agency. More full disclosure, I've long wanted to enroll in one of John's courses on media and society, but I'm too afraid of all the readings and that I might not pass. In addition to being a professor of journalism and before that of advertising and mass communication, John is a much sought after media commentator and critic. Prior to joining the Academy, John won all kinds of awards and accolades as a TV, radio, and print journalist and producer. John's relentless curiosity and wit celebrate and skewer human endeavors in all their gore and all their glory. His sweet spots, of course, are media, journalism, advertising, and politics. But his unflinching and often hilarious observations extend to every corner of the communication spectrum. An equal opportunity critic and champion, John calls them like he sees them without bias or exception. Like Twain, John's impeccably crafted jabs and uppercuts are powerful and yet somehow soft, thanks to his humility and his humanism. He artfully comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable, just as we need our journalists, our critics, and our professors to do. We're in for a treat. My friend and colleague, John Carroll.
Thank you, Steve. I gather the checks are still clearing. Steve asked me a couple of months ago to come here and talk, and I said, I'm not an expert in healthcare marketing, and Steve said, what of it? And so I said, okay. I'm delighted to be here. I thought perhaps I could send you off giving you an overview of the state of the news media, the things that have changed, the way it's evolved over the last 20 years, and the sort of condition we find ourselves in now. So before digital, the media landscape was vertical. There was a hierarchy of media. So you had the New York Times up here, you had CBS Evening News, you had Time Magazine, and down here, you had Inside Edition and People Magazine and other people. And there was a priority given to the top of the media landscape. And they set the agenda. So there was the famous journalist, R.W. Apple, Johnny Apple, who wrote for the New York Times. And if he had a front page piece in the Times, it would set the political discourse agenda for days. Now, in the digital era, we have something that's very different. We have a media landscape that is horizontal. And virtually everybody's on the same level now. It's all information. Virtually anybody can set the agenda at this point. It could be the Times, it could be TMZ, it could be Twitter, it could be virtually anybody because of the digital evolution of the media. So when I think of the news media, I think of it in really two areas, technological and political. So I just want to talk a little bit about the technology because it's something that has influenced the news media in terms of political coverage. So what we have with digital platforms is the next stage of the democratization of publishing. So think in terms of who was able to publish for centuries and centuries. It was people who had the ability to print stuff, right? So the great New Yorker writer A.J. Liebling said back in the 50s, freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one, which was absolutely true. And then technology started to change. So many people don't talk about this, but in 1959, one of the most revolutionary technological advances occurred in the Xerox 914 copier. The Xerox 914 copier changed the landscape in a significant way. For one thing, in business, it changed things dramatically. But also, it led to this sort of renaissance of self-publishing. So people could start publishing their own work in a way they never could before. And you had people who are able to refashion material and make something else of it. You could take a chapter from this book, a chapter from this book, put them together, and you have a third entity. And so people were able now to start doing something that only very powerful, very rich people had been able to do before. The internet comes along, and that's the next stage of the democratization of publishing, because at that point, you have not only the ability to create material, you have the ability to distribute it. So all of a sudden now, there is a completely different media landscape, and people have a completely different role in how they fit into the media landscape. Your voice can be as important as David Brooks's voice, or as important as Gail Collins's voice. You have the ability to do something that people did not have the ability to do before. And so as technology advances, the media landscape the balance of power starts to shift in terms of who is able to influence public discourse, who is able to set the agenda. So I want to show you a chart. This is a chart, a woman named Mary Meeker, who's an analyst at a venture capital firm. Every year she puts forward a slide deck of sort of the state of the media. And so I'm going to show you sort of the evolution of different media, and also this will give you a sense of where advertising dollars are going as well. So here we have the amount of time spent in media versus the percentage of advertising spending in 2011. So what you see is 7% of people's time is spent in print, but 25% of advertising dollars go to print. Okay? If you look across there's radio, there's television, and there's mobile. And mobile is 10% of time and 1% of advertising dollars. So there's this huge gap in mobile in terms of how much people pay attention to it and how much advertisers pay attention to it. Now we can watch it change. 2012, all of a sudden, 6% in print, and it's down to 23%. Mobile is up to 12% of time and 3% of advertising dollars. Now we have print shrinking more and more. Television is holding pretty steady. Mobile keeps going up. We're looking at 20% of time now and 4% of advertising. Print keeps disappearing, our poor print brethren. This is why I think Jeff went to stat. And what you have is 24% of time spent on mobile. And now in 2015, you have 25%, sorry. And now in 2016, you have 28%. So it's going up and the dollars are going up as well. But what this is doing is it's changing the media landscape again, because people now have a tool that they didn't have before to basically carry media with them. And with mobile comes a larger emphasis on social media. So I think everybody has been following the Facebook mishigas that's gone on with Cambridge Analytica. You may not have seen the headline in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago. Facebook gave device makers deep access to data on users and friends. So basically they were giving your information over to Apple, Samsung, other device makers. This is something that is becoming more and more apparent to people, that the cost of mobile is something, and the cost of social media is something that we had not anticipated. But there are also things that are happening behind the scenes. I just want to read you a couple of paragraphs from a piece in the Weekly Standard that ran right after Mark Zuckerberg went down to Washington, to Capitol Hill, to testify. And this is a piece called "Mr. Zuckerberg Goes to Washington." Facebook's long-term plans for its users' data are far grander than merely selling targeted political ads during the next election cycle. Consider a 2014 patent application by Facebook for something called Techniques for Emotion Detection and Content Delivery. The application outlines a method for capturing, analyzing, and using data about individuals' emotional experiences in real time. Facebook has been buying facial recognition technology companies for years and already uses artificial intelligence and proprietary algorithms to analyze users' emotional experiences. As this patent application suggests, Facebook could soon deliver targeted information to advertisers or theoretically to any other entity that it decided to consider a client based on what it surmises are users' real-time emotions, which would be gleaned from monitoring users' facial expressions through their smartphone cameras or webcams and analyzing them via emotional detection software. No wonder Zuckerberg covers the camera on his own laptop with tape. That's where Facebook is going. That's where technology is going. And so what we have is this increasingly sophisticated technological world that has a tremendous influence on how the news is gathered, how the news is distributed. Two other things I wanted to mention, two nets that you should be keeping an eye on. One is net neutrality, and the other is Netflix. The FCC just this past week overturned the net neutrality policy of the Federal Communications Commission. What that means is previously everybody was treated equally by internet service providers. Nobody was faster, nobody was slower, nobody disappeared. Everybody was treated equally and delivered in an equal manner. That is no longer the policy of the United States government now. So this is something that could affect people in significant ways, everyday people, especially with considering the mergers that are going on when AT&T buys Time Warner. Think of what if AT&T wants to compete in a more ruthless way than it already does. It favors Time Warner and it disadvantages Comcast, NBC Universal. There are states that are trying to end run this. There is activity on Capitol Hill that is looking to try to return to the old policy, but there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. The other, well, recent survey says 60% of registered voters, including 63% of Republicans, support net neutrality, but unfortunately, Donald Trump is not one of them. So even if this passes on Capitol Hill, it's probably not going to be signed in. So this is something to keep an eye on. What are the effects going to be of the end of net neutrality? The other net is Netflix. Netflix is leading in streaming video. They plan to invest $8 billion this year to develop 1,000 original titles. They want to change the way we watch television. The head of Netflix, a guy named Reed Hastings, when asked who his competition was, he said, "My competition is Snapchat, YouTube, and sleep." That's a big difference from ABC, NBC, CBS. So that is something also to keep an eye on. And finally, on the tech front, there is a company in Japan called News Digest. It is a newsroom run by robots. It combines social media and artificial intelligence. It uses machine learning to find breaking news in social media posts, and an algorithm writes it up as news reports. It's described as a newsroom staffed by engineers. All these things are going to start affecting the news we receive, both the way we receive it and the content that we receive. So that brings me to political news and the political end of the news business. And digital media have had a significant influence on politics and political coverage. A former Barack Obama aide said in 2015, if 2004 was about Meetup, and he's talking about the presidential campaigns, if 2004 was about Meetup, 2008 was about Facebook, and 2012 was about Twitter, 2016 is going to be about Meerkat or something like it. Anybody been using Meerkat lately? It didn't turn out that way, right? 2016 was about what? It was about fake news. Fake news became the central issue in news coverage. Fake news didn't just happen in 2016. Fake news has been around for a long time. So Herodotus, the Greek historian, we know him as the father of history. He was known in his time as the father of lies. He was thought to be basically dealing out gossip and untruths and politically motivated tales to suit his own agenda. So this is something, fake news, that goes back a long time. Sorry. There are all kinds of stories we see through history. I'll just tell you one. In 1835, the New York Sun engineered what is known as the Great Moon Hoax. And they saw that an astronomer named Sir John Herschel, a British astronomer, was going to the Cape of Good Hope to try to map the sky from the southern hemisphere. And they decided that they were going to turn this into a tale that was going to be well worth telling. And so what they did was they started covering his trip, and they started telling people that not only was he going to map the sky, but he was actually going to go to the moon. Not on gossamer wings, but in this amazing spacecraft. And when he got there, this is what he found. These were the moon creatures. And interestingly enough, this is from an Italian newspaper. This was a viral story. It started in the New York Sun and spread to hundreds of other newspapers, to dozens of other countries. This was something that was basically one of the first viral stories, or an early viral story. We look around at the media world now and we see things and we think, a viral story, that's something completely new. But it's not. There are many things now that are different in kind and in form, but not different in nature. And so viral news and the spreading of hoaxes is something that has occurred throughout history to a large degree. So we have this situation with fake news. And when 2016 started out, fake news fell into two basic categories, right? One was stories fabricated for financial profit, and the other was stories fabricated for ideological purposes, for ideological objectives. So I want to just take you through the anatomy of a fake news story. And this was a piece that occurred in the New York Times back in January. So it's October of 2016. Donald Trump is in Columbus, Ohio, and he's getting the sense that he's going to be on the losing end on Election Day. And he starts talking about the election being rigged. So he's giving a speech to a rally and talking about the election being rigged. In a suburb outside Baltimore, a guy named Cameron Harris, who just graduated from college and had college loans to pay off, is watching this rally, and he thinks, you know what? I could make a good story out of this about people rigging the election. So he decides, I'm going to write up a story about Hillary Clinton having, or an electrical worker in a warehouse in Columbus, Ohio, stumbling across these ballot boxes filled with pre-marked ballots for Hillary Clinton. And so he writes up a headline. He goes to Google and he Googles on Google Images, oops, sorry. I'm totally lost. Sorry. I have no idea what that was. Okay, so he goes to Google Images and he Googles ballot boxes. And what he finds is a picture of a person standing behind these big black plastic boxes, conveniently labeled ballot boxes. And he decides, he's my engineer. He's my electrical worker who stumbles on these. And he gives him a name, Randall Prince. He goes out and he buys a defunct website called ChristianTimesNewspaper.com, and he concocts his story, and okay, so this is really a lesson in technology, right? So here's his Instagram post. So Christian Times newspaper breaking tens of thousands of fraudulent Clinton votes found in Ohio warehouse. And he sends this out. He sets it up on basically six or half a dozen Facebook pages. He sends it out, and basically, over the course of the next few days, it's shared by 6 million people. 6 million people see it. And he makes, for 15 minutes of work, $22,000 in a couple of days. So this is that first kind of fake news, the fake news that's generated to make money. And this website at one point was valued at $100,000. And Cameron Harris decided, I'm going to hang on to it for a little longer. And guess what? All of a sudden, Google and Facebook changed their algorithm. So these kinds of posts didn't get as much circulation as before, and the site was worth nothing. So he didn't make any money from that. So there's a certain justice in that. And he admits that it was about money. He had no ideological preference in terms of the election. He just said negative stories about Hillary Clinton sell better. That people are more willing to believe that Hillary Clinton would do this than that Donald Trump would do it. And so he basically took advantage of that. There were others who were basically driven by ideology, and they created similar kinds of fraudulent stories. But then Donald Trump came along and redefined fake news, so now it doesn't really mean much of anything, because fake news is just whatever he doesn't like, whatever doesn't work from his standpoint. But what's happened is the whole dynamic has basically soured the public on the news media in some really alarming ways. So I'm just going to give you a couple of quick statistics. An ABC Washington Post poll found that 52% of Americans think that news organizations regularly produce false stories. A Monmouth University poll said 77% of Americans believe major news outlets report fake news, up 13 points from the year before. Nearly a third of people in one survey believe mainstream media news report fake news regularly. So all of this basically is eroding the standing of the news media. And one of the interesting things about this, this dynamic is what actually people think fake news, the term fake news means. So here's a chart of what people label fake news. Media outlets that pass on conspiracy theories, unsubstantiated rumors, news stories from real organizations are unfair or sloppy, made-up stories from news outlets that don't exist. That would be our friend Cameron Harris. Journalists from real news organizations making stuff up. Look at the numbers that are there. The numbers that are there are startling. And this is something that has become a major issue for news organizations, the undermining of the public's confidence in what they do. Not only that, the range of things that now the public labels as fake news. Fake news used to be fabricated stories, not a mistake that somebody makes. Fake news used to be basically things that were not true, not editorial choices that news organizations make. You know, the front page of the New York Times isn't fake news because you don't agree with the stories they pick, but that's what's starting to happen. So right now, the most recent Gallup poll says 32% of the American public have a great deal or a fair amount of trust in mass media. So 2 out of 3 people do not, which is a remarkable state of affairs. This has caused the news media to start taking some significant actions, or try to at any rate. One of the things that has changed is the willingness of news media outlets, to use the word lie. This is a great debate in the news media right now. When do you say something is a lie or not? And the debate centers around whether you know that somebody knowingly says something that is false, that there needs to be intent for a lie. And so the Wall Street Journal, for instance, says, we can't get into Donald Trump's head, so we can't say whether it's a lie or not. The New York Times says, we know a lie from a falsehood, from something misleading. We will use the term lie. And they go back and forth. And every news organization has to decide what we're going to do. But more and more of them are using a word that they would never use in the past. News organizations were very reluctant to ever use the word lie. But you see it all the time now. So that's one great debate. That's one thing that's happening. Anonymous sources have become as common as Kleenex. Anonymous sources, this is the leakiest White House, I think, in history. And so you see stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times that have, usually a news story, you need 2 sources, anonymous or not. That's always been the standard. You need 2 independent sources. There are stories coming out in the Washington Post that have 18 sources, that have 20 sources of White House officials and people familiar with whatever the topic is. That's something that has changed dramatically. Another thing that's changed dramatically that is not so good is this zero tolerance policy that many news organizations have adopted. So you may have seen CNN had a situation last year where they reported some connection between Anthony Scaramucci and Russian investment firms, and the story was shaky at best, and so the CNN basically said, we're retracting this story, but they did more than that. They fired the 3 journalists who were involved, which is something that is really drastic and something that is a really overreaction to many people's minds to the current, current news environment. I'll just tell you one quick story about Woodward and Bernstein, the sainted Woodward and Bernstein, who back in the Watergate days, they were having a lunch with a publisher talking about publishing a book on the same day that they had published a front page story under their bylines that was not true. They had said Bob Haldeman had testified to something in front of a grand jury. That was not true. So that was front page major error on their part. And all kinds of news organizations went to Ben Bradley, the celebrated editor, and said, we want to comment. And so David Halberstam, in his book, The Powers That Be, talks about Bradley typing up 37 different responses to the newspapers, or to the media requests, trying to figure out what are we going to say about Woodward and Bernstein, who made this terrible front page mistake. And finally, he threw them all in the trash, and he said, just tell them we stand by our guys. That's a lot different from what CNN is doing. Jeff Zucker, the head of CNN, says we need to play error-free ball. That's impossible for a news organization. You cannot do that. And so if that's the standard, and that has become the standard at CNN, that's something that is detrimental to the news business. What else has changed? Newspapers are trying to establish their own legitimacy at this point. So essentially, newspapers are going out there and trying to convince the public that they play an important role in society. So, sorry, bear with me for a second. So, right after Donald Trump became president, the Washington Post started running underneath the banner on its front page the phrase, "Democracy dies in darkness." And the editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, said, sounds like a great title for the next Batman movie. But basically, the Post thought, we need to talk about how serious this situation is. But this survey makes you wonder if that message means anything to the public. So this is the views of the role of the news media in American democracy. Protects, hurts, neither. 28% of the public says it protects democracy. 71% of journalists say it protects democracy. So does democracy dies in darkness really mean that much to the American public? This is just one snapshot. But this is the dynamic that news organizations are facing now. Other news organizations have done similar things. There are other campaigns that have come out, sort of what I've called the Pep Squad for Truth. So here's a New York Times ad that ran, a full-page ad. Truth is what we search for every day. This is a TV commercial that I will attempt to play that ran on the Academy Awards.
The truth is, our nation is more divided than ever.
The truth is, alternative facts are just plain delusional.
The media needs to be held
The truth is, locker room talk is harmless.
The truth is, we need to put the safety of the American people.
The truth is, we need a full investigation of any type of
So that's an effort that the Times is making to say we are not only important, but we are reliable. This is a campaign from the Wall Street Journal, the face of real news. That is John Carroll, who you may have seen the fruits of his labor when Elizabeth Holmes was indicted in the Theranos case. He is the one who basically blew the lid off Theranos. So the Wall Street Journal is trying to do the same thing. Why are you doing that to me? Okay, sorry, folks. I wish I was.
Have you ever?
Yeah. Try again. So the Boston Globe has one as well. So this is something that is becoming commonplace. Boston Globe is saying real journalism, a real journalist, and they have ads running that say you can handle the truth, and you find it right here. I was hoping that the Boston Herald would actually run a campaign saying you can handle the other truth, and you can find it right here, but that didn't work out. This is either whistling past the graveyard or preaching to the choir. It's really hard to know which. But these are the lengths that news organizations have gone to try to prove not only their relevance, but their reliability. Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes just talked to a group at an award show and told an anecdote about talking to Donald Trump in 2016 about all the insults he aimed at journalists. And Leslie Stahl says, I said, you know, this is getting tired. Why are you doing this? You're doing it over and over. It's boring, and it's time to end that. And Trump said, you know why I do it? I do it to discredit you all and demean you all, so when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you. So basically, the goal is to make truth a jump ball. And that is, to a large degree, what's happened. Just two more quick things I wanted to mention. One is somewhere here. The wear-out factor. So this is a chart of people's reaction to the amount of news that is out there. Okay? So 68% say they're worn out by the amount of news. And interestingly, the Republicans are higher, 77%, as opposed to 61% of Democrats. So this is an atmosphere where newspapers and mainstream media, news outlets are trying to establish a new connection with people, and people are saying, enough already. You know, we really don't want it. Last thing is journalist perception of their readers. So this chart shows basically people's understanding of what journalists do. So what do you understand? They asked them, do you know what native advertising is? 57% said, not really. Do you know what an op-ed is? 50% said, not really. Difference between an analyst and a commentator. 29% didn't know. But look at the journalist. 83% of journalists think that the public doesn't know the difference between an analyst and a commentator. 60% of journalists think the public doesn't know the difference between an editorial and a news story. 60% of journalists think the public doesn't know the difference between a news story and a press release. Journalists don't understand the news consumer as well as they should. And news consumers are a lot smarter than journalists think they are. And so I think that in the end, if the news media want to solve the problem that they have increasingly, what they need to do is to reach out and connect more with news consumers. And they would do that through transparency, they would do that through clarity, they would do that through showing their work. And that's all the work I have to show. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions. Yes, sir. There's a mic. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'm a print guy.
Thank you, John. I'm wondering if what we really have was a golden age of journalism from perhaps 1965 to 2007 or 8. And before that, we basically had an environment of fake news. You go back to the 19th century and journalism then. And if that's the case, are we going to ever return to that golden age of objective, in-depth coverage that we had in a relatively short period of time? And if not, are there better ways for people to discern real news from fake news? And I don't mean educated people, but people generally. And my last comment is everyone should, if they can, watch the Showtime 4-part series on the New York Times and how the Times creates news. Absolutely fascinating insights into the news business.
Yeah, it's terrific. It's called The Fourth Estate. To answer your question, I'm not sure that that was a golden age. Everybody looks back and thinks that there was a particular golden age. There were problems in every age, but there was a time when the foundation of the mainstream news media was very different. Are we going back to that time? I'm sorry to say we are never going back to that time. That's not going to happen because a whole new generation is coming up that does not want what we wanted. And until they find out, until they discover for themselves that there is value in in-depth, investigative, public service journalism, until they find that out, it's going to be difficult for news organizations to basically bring the next generation up. So the kinds of things that Jeff and his folks over at Stat are doing, those are going to be the bridge, I think, to whatever comes next. But going back to what we had, I don't think that's going to happen because I think we have a whole new generation of news consumers that don't value the things that we came to value because they were what we had. So basically, I get 4 newspapers a day. at home. I keep telling my students, I'm not going to be here forever getting these newspapers. Somebody's got to pick up the slack here. But it's not their fault. It's the fault of the news organizations for not convincing them that they have something that is valuable enough, that is unique enough, that is worthwhile enough to pay for. And if they can't make that sale, they're not going to survive. So the New York Times has done a terrific job of making the transition from being an advertising-supported news organization to being a subscription-supported news organization. They have shifted what was the traditional ratio of advertising revenue to subscription revenue. It used to be 80-20, advertising to subscription. At the New York Times now, it's 60-40 the other way. That's the only way people are going to survive at this point. Ad-driven, especially digital publishers. Digital publishers who rely on ad revenue are not going to have a very bright future. I think we're going to see a shakeout in some really significant ways in the next couple of years in terms of the digital-only publishers. If BuzzFeed can't figure out a way to make money other than through advertising, BuzzFeed is going to have a real struggle to survive. So I think that there will be a new kind of journalism that will be worthwhile and beneficial. I just don't think it's going to be the kind that we grew up with and have been most comfortable with. I think it's going to be a completely different kind. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
I recently went to a talk where Madeleine Albright spoke, and she said she issued a relevant, she's written a book called Fascism, A Warning. And that, I think much of that message is relevant here and would, well, it would be helpful in directing some millennials to real news.
To warn them about fascism? Yeah, that's not really my job, all due respect. I mean, my attempt is to educate students to understand that things haven't always been this way, and that there are things of value that are perhaps unfamiliar to them or uncomfortable to them, and to try to introduce them to some kind of historical perspective on what's gone before and what is worthwhile and what is essential and what is not. And I'll just tell you a real quick story, and then I'm going to let you go because there are prizes to be awarded. So I used to work at WGBH, and I was executive producer of news programs there. And they have a community advisory board that would meet every couple of months. And they would trot me out in front of it to talk about the public affairs and news shows that we were doing. And invariably, someone would say to me, how are you going to, I was the exec producer of a show called Greater Boston, nightly news and public affairs show. And they would say, how are you going to get young people to watch the show? And I would say, I'm not. And they would say, why not? I said, because they're not going to watch the show. And they said, well, what could you do to make them watch the show or to get them to watch the show? And I said, give them a mortgage. Because as soon as they have a mortgage, they're going to want to know a whole bunch of stuff that we talk about every night. But until then, there's no use chasing them, because not only would I not get them, but I would lose the audience that I already have. That's the situation that a lot of news organizations are in. And if they can survive long enough for all the young people, all of my students, to get a mortgage, I think they may be able to make it. So that's my most optimistic view. Thank you very much.